In our last lecture module, we were contemplating Kim's argument to the effect that Quine's epistemology is not an epistemology at all, but merely a call to engage in a project of a descriptive, causal, nomological explanation of belief genesis devoid of any normative or evaluative content. Now, Kim makes these claims, but he doesn't make them independent of any textual analysis. I just find the textual analysis uncompelling. So, for example, he cites the following partial sentence from a footnote from Quine's article, Grades of Theoreticity. If we are seeking only the causal mechanism of our knowledge of the external world, and not a justification of that knowledge in terms prior to science. Now, if we just look at that part of that sentence in a footnote, from a different paper in isolation, it may seem as though we found some solid evidence in support of Kim's hypothesis. However, if we merely look at the entire sentence, I think that interpretation becomes much, much more strained. The dilemma is dissolved and the strain relieved when we give up the dream of a first philosophy firmer than science. If we are seeking only the causal mechanism of our knowledge of the external world, and not a justification of that knowledge in terms prior to science, we can settle after all for a theory of vision in Berkeley's style, based upon color patches in a two-dimensional visual field. Now, this isn't exactly the perfectly crystalline clear statement of an idea, though it's a very well-written sentence from a stylistic point of view. But what it does do is it brings out that emphasis that we talked about when we were talking about Quine's article, that difference between trying to justify science in a manner external to science, i.e. by appealing to certainty as this ontologically neutral, epistemically unassailable, and independent basis for justifying our beliefs, and the project that he seemed to outline, the idea of understanding how it is that our beliefs get their epistemic merit by drawing upon the very resources of science to help us to establish a minimum set of ontological commitments with which we can then begin to frame and formulate a theory. If we do that, it doesn't seem so convincing at all that Quine, in fact, has the project that Kim accuses him of in mind. Nevertheless, Kim thinks that Quine uses the failure of classical deductive foundationalism to argue for an anormative notion of epistemology which studies, quote unquote, patterns of law-like dependencies characterizing the input and output relations for this particular organisms and others of like physical structure. Quine intends his notion of epistemology, Kim thinks, to succeed classical deductive foundationalism, yet its clear abandonment of the notions of justification and knowledge place it outside of the domain of epistemology. Nor will Quine's theory help us to understand the relation of evidence to theory, itself a normative epistemic relation. Now, I remain skeptical of Kim's suggestions here. Many quote Quine's rhetorical flourishes as a substitute for a careful, sympathetic analysis of his position. Though he directs epistemologists to study the relationship between the meager input and the torrential output, I can find no place where he ever actually says explicitly that one ought to think of those inputs and outputs only under a causal description, that we should in effect seal ourselves off from any understanding of this relation in terms of inference. This, I think, is a projection on Kim's part. And I think part of the problem here is that many of these comparisons between ethics and epistemology have an implicit claim that normative recommendations are in some way strongly divorced from empirical considerations, and part of some special province accessible only to philosophers or to philosophical methodology. In fact, empirical and relatively aphilosophical considerations strongly motivate most of the normative contexts in which we engage. Consider a couple of examples. Research into material science shows us how to build a better computer chip. Those are norms, but they're not norms that only philosophers could conceive of. Research into biochemistry and practical experience have married to create norms regarding winemaking, and so on. When we think about many of our activities, they're regulated by norms, but those norms weren't developed by, justified by, and then disseminated from philosophy. Let's turn our attention now to Kim's argument that Quine's epistemology is not consistent and hence isn't really a well-conceived project at all. So to further strengthen his argument that Quine's epistemology isn't adequate, much less a better kind of epistemology, Kim's going to argue that Quine's attempt to divorce epistemology from normativity precludes it from even having beliefs or representational content as part of its subject matter. Attributing content, Kim says, requires radical interpretation. That's the rational presumption argument that we saw earlier in Kornblith. Radical interpretation requires that we understand the system of beliefs and other propositional attitudes as rational and coherent. The rationality requirement, at least, is a normative requirement. Hence, Quine's project cannot engage in content attribution since it forbids normative notions. Now again, this argument only is as good as the claim that Quine in fact forbids normative notions within his epistemic project, a claim that I don't think Kim has actually made good on. Now, in the next and last lecture module, we'll go over Kim's arguments that traditional epistemology, as traditionally conceived, really is a plausible project that could possibly be completed.